Okay, so now we're going to do a bigger scale simulation. So I'm assuming that you have watched the previous videos on Realflow in this Realflow playlist on my YouTube channel. So a lot of the stuff, sort of the beginner learning Realflow type stuff, I'm not going to do so much of that here. I'm going to assume that some of the concepts that I covered in those videos, you've gone over and have an understanding of those. So if you have not watched those videos, I would suggest going in and doing that just so that we're not rehashing the same information over and over again. Okay, so what I have here is a little kind of waterfall set here. Water is going to float out of this little river here and then sort of cascade down these rocks and then eventually pour off the end here. So it's like a multi-layered sort of waterfall thing here. It's a small little set. Obviously, I could extend the geometry as far as I want. You know, eventually I'll probably put vegetation and what have you in here. So in planning ahead, I've planned for a camera angle. So let me just make a camera here. And let's go ahead and look through that camera and let's turn on our resolution gate here. So, you know, I'm planning on having something of this angle here. It could be animated starting here and sort of coming as the water comes down and then going there. So if I'm at this angle, you could see here the way I've modeled this, I can't really see this in here. So I would only need to simulate water starting over here to run down here. Just because the rest of it will be obscured. If I put plants and stuff in here, it'll be all obscured. So in an effort to make the scene kind of efficient, you know, you don't want to simulate more than you need. So that's why I just kept this short here. If I was going to have the camera at an angle like this, then obviously I'd need to have more of this river in here. But at a lower angle like this, you know, even as I move the camera around, this will be fine, and then I can do set extensions as needed. Okay, so for the simulation itself, I don't need to bring everything. If I did have more set, I wouldn't need to bring any of that into Realflow because it does not really do me any good. Okay, so to for the actual simulation, I've created a bunch of rocks in here, and these rocks are all on the same UV map. Okay, so I made these using Sasha Henrix's rock tutorial, and I just really simplified the UVs. They're all just sort of rectangles, as you can see. It's just really simple for what I needed them. These are called the wet rocks, and the wet rocks are the ones that are likely to have to collide with the water. So, you know, I've been very sort of liberal with that. Some of them might not end up being wet, but just in case, I included a bunch. And then the rest of them are just, I call these the non-interactive rocks. These are rocks that are not really going to be touching the water. So those are on their own. So the UV maps here, I didn't combine them all into one UV map. So combine these into one UV map so that if all the wet maps that I generate, I just need one image sequence versus if these were separate, if these were all separate rocks with their own UVs, excuse me. If these were separate rocks with their own UVs, then I would, if I want to generate wet maps, it'd be this many wet maps. So however many rocks this is, that's how many wet map sequences I'd have to deal with. And that is just entirely inefficient and unnecessary. So to keep things simple, I have just put all these on the same UV map. You know, if I need the resolution, I can make it a 4K map. I can make it an 8K map if I want for the texturing. So it's not a big deal to put them all on one map. If I had more rocks than this that I had to do, I could simply do some UDIMs, so I could use multiple tiles, but I didn't want to go into that. But that's definitely something that you can do is just use multiple tiles and use the UDIM workflow. Okay, but to keep it simple, I just kept it on a single tile, and that's the rocks. You can see that they're decimated because I put them into ZBrush and decimated them. In that way, they don't have to be super high res. Just these rocks by themselves, only about 108,000 faces, which is not much at all. The non-interactive rocks you can see are a little bit higher resolution, and these are about 206,000. Now I have all these rocks, you know, in case I need to rearrange them or do whatever. I still have them. These are the high poly rocks in here. So if I if I show this is the same rocks, but these are not. They're a little bit more higher resolution. So you can see there's a lot of rocks in here, and all that is about 1.26 million faces. So I didn't want to take all that in the ZBrush, so I lowered them down a little bit, and then combine them into one. And then I just keep this as a backup in case I need to maybe rearrange some stuff. Okay, so the idea here, you can see I put a whole bunch of rocks in here. The idea is to give the water something to collide with, right? The more stuff the water has to collide with, the more interesting sort of the water is going to be. If it's just wide open here, you're going to get this very boring, very lifeless water that just flows in an uninteresting shape. It's just not going to be fun to look at. So you got to give the water something to do. You got to give the water things to bump into so that you get all those tendrils of water, the splashing and what have you. That's going to enhance your simulation considerably. So try not to leave too much just open room right here because, you know, CG fluid simulations tend to look fake if they don't have a lot of stuff to bounce against. So all this forcing the water to go around these rocks is also causing it to then go around a rock and then come back and collide with itself, as it goes down there. So all that is just adding that nice, beautiful detail to the water. Okay, so and then here, this is like a rock face here. This land here would be more dirt, but this is more rock, and this one here is just one of these rocks that I took and just enlarged it and chopped it. So that's what it looks like here. I had to extrude it a little bit so you can see. Not great geometry, but it honestly doesn't matter because that stuff is not visible, so it's fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to generate 3 sets of wet maps. So a wet map for the rocks, a wet map for the actual dirt itself. So as the water is sort of going against here, generating wet maps, and here where I have this pathway for someone to walk in there, there's going to be wet maps generated in here so that the water looks like it's actually wetting the dirt as it goes by. And then one for the rock face here. So as the water pours over, it's going to wet the surface of the rock here. So I'm going to have 3 different sets of wet map sequences. Okay, so I just exported. I just did OBJs. Again, you can do SDs if you like. I did OBJs. I'm just so used to using OBJs. So I had an OBJ for the rock face, for the dirt, and then for the wet rocks, I did not bring the non-interactive rocks into Realflow because they're not going to touch the water. At least that's the hope. So they don't need to be in there. So into Realflow, this is what we have right here. Okay, so again, I'm assuming that you watched the previous videos because I've done some things in here that I also did in the previous ones, so it should be pretty easy to follow along. So we have our wet rocks right there. We have the dirt here, and then we have the rock face right here. Okay, so by default, the color is orange. If you want to, color this a different color, you can come in here, and I don't know if you want this to be more like grass or whatever, you can turn it green. It doesn't really matter. It's entirely up to you what colors you want to go with. So if you want to just differentiate, you can do that. I'm going to hit G just to get rid of my grid here. Okay, so I have a kill volume. Okay, that's that green square around the whole scene so that I don't have particles flying all over the place and having to be calculated way out in the middle of nowhere. So I have the kill volume in there. Then I have my gravity, which gravity, all I ever do with it is just bring it in and I leave it at the default. The default value, strength value is 9.8, so 9.8 meters a second, or negative 9.8 meters a second, I guess, technically, which is real-life gravity. And then I hook those into a hub here just so that anytime I need to hook into those, I could just plug into the hub. I don't have to keep making multiple connections. Okay. Then I have the rocks, the rock face, and the land right there. I created this back wall right here. So what that is, because I don't have this is just wide open, and what might happen is water might start to pour out this way, and I might start to lose some particles that way. I could have just done that in Maya, but no big deal. I used a cube, and I used a cube, not a plane, because if you remember from the last videos, planes don't really react too well. Particles tend to penetrate through them, so I use a cube here that I flattened out and just closed off the back there. So any water that's going to be back there is going to just bounce off there and then be forced back down there. there's a little bit of a slope going down, so the water will always flow that way. But if I didn't have this back wall here, what would happen is as I keep adding more and more water, there's going to be force that's sort of caused to go that way. So when that happens, then water will start to spill over, even though there's a gradient going down that way. So let's put a back wall in there. And again, you're not going to be able to see that because once I have, once I render it at the camera angle I want, it's going to be something like this. And that's going to be well out of sight. This box is not going to go back to Maya. It's just going to be there just for the simulation. So put a little back wall there. And by default, the volume mode is set to solid inside. Okay, so that's good. The other thing that I did here, you can see these are just planes, right? So these are just planes. So what I did here, I actually duplicated them off. So I'm going to show these, and I'm going to just isolate these. So this is my actual ground plane. You see I gave it thickness. I just extruded and thickened it. And this is what I get here. Now, why does it look like this? I'll show you here. So let's bring this back. Let's get our, where's our land here? There it is. So I'll show you what I did. I just duplicated this. Let's isolate that. And then I hit Control E to do an extrude, grab the blue arrow and pull it down. You can see though, the problem is you get some of this sort of interpenetrations in here. So while these lower faces are selected, Control right click, go to vertices, So I'm just going to convert my selection to a vertex selection. Okay, and then what I can do is if I hold down shift and right click, it'll go to average vertices and just keep hitting G. It's going to keep repeating that. You can see it's sort of relaxing this interpenetration in here a little bit, so it's not so extreme. There's still some going on, but at this point I think we're good. So that is now a thickened piece of geometry, so it's an actual volume. It's not just a plane, and that's going to work better in Realflow. Okay, so that's all I did there. Let's get these again here. Same thing with the rock wall. This geometry is not exactly pretty, so but again, it doesn't really matter. Just thickened it and then just relaxed, just averaged the vertices in there, which just relaxed everything. Okay, and then of course the rocks here. Okay, so that's what I brought into Realflow. That way I'm not dealing with just flat planes. So everything has got some thickness to it, and it doesn't affect the UVs in any way. So your wet maps can still be generated just fine. Okay, so next thing, and I'm just going to go ahead and just delete these emitters here. Okay, so we've used the standard particles in the previous videos and the diverso for the fire hydrant. So the next type of particle is this Hybrido particles here. Now, Hybrido particles are designed for much larger scale simulations. These are voxel based. So if we look at, say, our land here, there's a cell size value. So cell size determines the size of the voxels in the scene. So whenever you bring the object in here, it is subdivided into voxels. And those voxels are 0.1 meters in size. So 10 centimeter, if you think of 10 centimeter cubes that approximate the shape of this. If you can imagine it, it kind of looks like 8-bit sort of video game art. Or Minecraft, if you can imagine it that way. So the smaller the cell size is, the better quality you're going to get. The more those voxels are going to approximate the actual shape, the smaller you get. It's like pixels on a TV. If you got a TV with really large pixels, you're going to get a very pixelated image that doesn't have a lot of detail. But now with the 4K TVs, you got lots and lots of pixels. Or Apple monitors, which have the retina display where the pixel density is really high. So the more cells you have and the smaller those cells are, the closer the higher the detail you have. So if you lower this value, you can increase the quality of the simulation. Okay. And then if I go here to 1 and hit G to turn my grid on, I actually increased my scale. So my geometry scale right now is at 2. At 1, because I did some tests, at 1, I mean, these are meters. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, about 14 meters in this dimension. You'd think that was enough, but it actually wasn't. So I actually just increased this to 0.2. This is something, I increased it to 2. This is something that you're going to have to play with and figure out for yourself. Depending on your scene, it's going to be different. So for me, I'm going to try it at a value of 2. So I've basically just doubled that. So it's 14 before, it's like 28 now. So it's a really big scene. But again, Hybrido is designed for those big scenes. It's also worth noting that you can adjust your cell size scale here as a global value here. So at 1, what it means is that you're using the cell size that every object defaults to zero point 0.1. So when you if you got like a million objects in here, you don't want to have to go through each one. You can adjust your cell size scale here. So right now it's at 1, which means that the default is actually 0.1. If I set this to 0.5, this is going to be half of what it is. So it's going to be 0.05. So you can set this globally for everything if that's what you want to do. Okay, we don't have that many objects in there, so I don't need to do that. I can just set this myself on each object. There's literally only 3 objects. I don't really care what it is for the brick wall because I don't need it to be super accurate to that. So I'm not going to adjust that. But if you had individual rocks, for example, if you'd have brought all these rocks in individually, then each one of them would have a cell size. And you would have to go in and tweak it for each one, which is ridiculous. So rather than do that, you could just simply lower it in here, and that'd be a global value that you could lower. Okay, so let me hit 4 here. So there we go. Now, again, each object has a wet-dry texture thing. One thing to note is that wet-dry textures do not work with Hybrido particles, at least last that I heard. I have not heard of them being supported. So how do you get your wet maps? Well, where Hybrido particles differ from the Diverso and the standard particles is that they have what we call secondaries. So splash foam, bubbles, etc., etc. These here are added simulations to give you more detail. So the advantage of Hybrido is that you can have really high particle counts and not really kill your system too much. Okay, you can get to much higher particle counts than you can with the other ones, but the overall quality of the simulation, if you're really close, is not that high. So we compensate for that by adding splash. So you're gonna generate the basic what we call the core fluid, the main part of the simulation. We're gonna generate that first. Then when that's done, we're gonna tell it to use the cache on that. Then we're gonna generate the splash and the foam. So when things bump into each other, it's going to generate a splash that's made out of standard particles. Last I heard that the secondaries are made out of standard particles. So, and then also foam. As the rocks sort of land and churn and do all this stuff, there's going to be foam generated. And those splashes turn into foam. So those particles get converted to foam, which sits on the surface of the water. Now, these again are being generated out of standard particles, and standard particles do generate wet maps. So we're going to get our wet maps from our splash and our foam. We're not going to get it from the actual Hybrido particles. Okay, so that's a little thing that you got to do to get around the limitations of the Hybrido fluids, is that you have to generate your wet maps from the splash and the foam. There's even things like here waterline particles, which generates particles at the waterline where the water is touching the geometry. You can generate particles at that waterline, and those actually you can then use to generate your wet maps. And then of course there's mist. If you wanted to generate mist, we're not going to go that far in this one, but if you wanted to generate, like if you've seen big waterfalls, they tend to have a lot of mist around them, so you can generate all that in here in Realflow. Okay, so because you're generating so many different particles, what you're going to find is that you could end up using quite a bit of hard drive space to store all this stuff. Okay, that is one of the things with dynamic simulation, especially when you're doing fluids, is there's a lot of hard drive space that can be used. I've had simulations take up over 3 terabytes just in a single simulation. So just bear that in mind. Hard drive space is actually relatively cheap now. You can get, I don't know, 3 terabytes for maybe a little over $100 now, I think. So, it is what it is. That's just it's part of the game. I got two 4 terabyte drives in this system, and then I have a 1 terabyte NVMe M.2 drive in here. So And then also, the faster your hard drive is, the faster these things read off the hard drive. But my two 4 terabyte drives are just basic standard hard drives, and they work just fine. So you don't have to kill yourself buying anything fancy. Okay, so let's go ahead then and start to set up the main core simulation of the Hybrido here. So the way to do that, you have this domain, open closed domain. The closed domain just puts everything in a box. You don't really need it. You could set up the domain and then make the emitter, but the nice thing about Realflow is that if you click on an emitter, it's gonna, if there's not a domain already existing, it's just gonna make one for you. Now, for emission, if you remember, in the diverso particles, you have the different kinds of emitters here. And in the standard particles, you got pretty much the same thing. Well, Hybrido works a little bit differently. It uses an object, a polygon object, to be your emitter. Okay, so what that means is you need to give it an object. It's not just going to emit by itself. You actually have to give it a polygonal object to emit from. So I'm just going to use a box. You could use a sphere, you could use a box or whatever. I'm going to use just a cube. Make sure it's the closed cube, not the open top cube. So I'm going to hit cube. Okay, so here's my cube right here. This cube does not need to be hooked into anything. Okay, because it's not going to be reacting with gravity. It's not going to be reacting with any other things. It's actually not even going to be reacting with the fluids. It's just going to be use the volume of this cube to emit the fluids. So I'm going to grab this, and I'm just going to move it into position. So I want it over here somewhere, and I'm just gonna rotate. I'm gonna hit D a couple times here to get it to be hard shaded. Okay, so let's lower it this way, maybe thin it out a little bit, maybe widen it this way. I don't know. Really not a big deal. Okay, obviously the bigger it is, the more particles it puts out per frame, right? If I have it this long, it's going to put out a lot more particles per frame. So it's all dependent on the size of the thing, versus if I have it really skinny like this, then it's going to put out way less particles per frame, or per substep, I should say. Okay, so just, depending on how fast you want this water to come out of here, you can make it decently sized here. And I'm just going to move it down. Don't worry if it interpenetrates. It just won't generate particles where it's interpenetrating. That's fine. Okay, so, did I move that? There we go. Okay, so just position this where we want here. Then I'm going to hit D until I get the bounding box. I technically don't need to see the actual box. I like to have it in bounding box mode here just so I can see the bounding box. And this way, when the particles are emitted, if I have it shaded, I won't see the particles till they get pushed out of the box. So if I just have it as a bounding box, just keep hitting D until you get to that bounding box, then this is good. So we have our cube here. Might as well name this emitter. Okay, that's our emitter. So I'm going to put this down here. Then I'm going to go to Hybrido here, and I'm going to hit emitter. And let me undo that so you can see what I did. So make sure that this emitter is selected. Otherwise, it's going to ask you to give it an emitter. So if you have it already selected, then it knows to just use that. So select that emitter, then hit emitter, and immediately we have an emitter created right here. And notice that under object, it says emitter, so which is this guy. So I'm going to move this down here, and then automatically it connects to a domain because one didn't exist, so it had to create one. If there was one in there, then it would just hook into the existing one. Okay, so now we have our domain here. So let's go ahead and just name that domain. We're going to call this, I don't know, river water or whatever. It doesn't really matter. River water. Okay, and this is the actual Hybrido emitter. This to make this less confusing, let's call this emitter geo. So emitter geometry, and then this is the actual emitter. So it's just using that geometry as the shape to emit its water. So that's actually a really useful feature. Okay, again, you don't need to connect this to anything. It is connected because it is loaded in there, so we are good. So there's our river water. That's the domain. It's just an open domain. You can see it's this one. I honestly never use the closed domain. But if you want to just start with a swimming pool or something where the water is already in a pool, so it creates a closed domain with some water already in there. So if you're doing a swimming pool, that's actually kind of useful. But If not, then you're good. Okay, so we have our domain. You can see it's not hooked into the demons here or the geometry. So we'll just hook it into both of these. And again, you got to click on the icon. If you click where the name is, it'll move the node. But if you click on the icon, it'll actually try to connect. So now this is connected. Okay, so in the domain, we have a cell size. So cell size is, again, we're talking voxels. So that's a zero point 0.3 meters, zero point 0.3 meter voxel size. So let's go ahead and run this and see just how big or how low resolution, because that's a very, very high number. So the simulation is very low resolution here. So let's go ahead. I'm gonna change this back to something a little bit brighter so we can see better. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to select my emitter here, and then I'm going to save. Again, as usual, just before you hit simulate, always hit Control S. Notice that I have turned on command line. I need to speed this up. So, get in the habit of using command line. Use simulating right in the scene is fine for at the beginning when you're trying to just get things figured out. But I would go ahead and just use command line from the get-go. Okay, and I realize I had this scene already made. Again, I'm assuming you watched the previous videos, but just to import your objects, right here, import object. You can do it right there. No, I didn't show that at the beginning. So let's go ahead. I'm going to hit simulate, and it's going to bring this up. And we're going to let that run here. Now you notice that it took a little bit to get going, but it should start to go. So there we go. Frame 0 is started. And you can, there's some stats in here. So it's telling you for the river water, it's telling you how many cells, so those are the voxels, and how many particles are in the simulation. So right now at about 1,444 particles at a 0.3 cell size. So this is actually really useful information to keep an eye on here. It's got information about all the things. The rocks are 27,000 to 54,000 faces, etc., etc. So there's a lot of information here. Frame 6 is telling you the average frame time. And then it's telling you an estimate of how much longer this is going to take. So if I was to let this run for the entire 200 frames, it would take about 15 minutes. Now understand that this estimate is obviously not very good because it's estimating based on the particles that you have in the scene right now. Obviously, these particles are going to increase with every frame. So by the time we get to like frame 150, we're going to have quite a few more particles in the scene. So then that's going to skew the estimation. So I've never really found this to be too useful until you reach kind of an equilibrium where you have, because as you simulate this, you're going to have particles leaving the scene and particles entering the scene. So you want, once you reach that equilibrium where you're kind of losing as many as you're putting in, where the particle counts are staying kind of stable, then that number might actually mean something. But right now it doesn't really mean anything. It's based on about 4 seconds a frame for the entire 200 frames. That's what it would take. But obviously, as you get more particles in this scene, that's not going to be the case. Okay, so and while this is running, it's a nice thing about command line is while it's running, I can now hit this button over here to load up what it has done. And let's zoom in up here, and that's what we have. So you can see I only have like 10 or 12 frames here. So they get created in that cube, right? You get a cube of particles basically, and then gravity takes a hold of them, and they just sort of, form down into the riverbed right there. Now, right now, you can see that I have more or less the same 1,500 particles. It's about the same number of particles because I I haven't told Realflow to keep adding more as it goes. Okay, so it's just doing the same number of particles. Let's load up. Let's see, has it added any more? Okay, so that's what we have right now. So I'm gonna kill this. So the easy way to stop your simulation is just close that window. It might take a second to close, and then once it's closed, that has stopped the actual simulation. So obviously that's not what we want there. But you can see my resolution is not very high at all. Okay, so I'm going to want to increase my particles. And the easiest way to do that is decrease this number. So let's go to 0.15. I'm going to cut that in half. And then also we want to come to the emitter and we want to turn on stream. So stream basically says just keep adding more. Keep adding more particles with every iteration. Okay, and then right here, initial velocity, if you say none, it's just going to basically just drop particles, by gravity. It's going to keep adding them, and then they're just going to ooze out. If you want to actually give it some speed, you can do a constant or inherit. I just use constant, okay, and then you can give it a speed here. So again, this works like the other emitters where you can turn it off and turn it back on. If you set it to 0, it's going to turn off your water. If we do 5, again, trial and error. If you want angle variation, again, if you want to know, it sort of randomly sets particles in different directions according to the angles. So that's pretty nice. You can also do speed variation. So instead of just this constant speed here at 5 with everything, you can actually have the particles be less or more than that value. So we can put a little bit of that as well. So surface particle sampling and core particle sampling. So these values here just determine on the surface of the fluid what you want basically the resolution to be. So if you want to have more detail on the top of the simulation versus on the core, where the core is sort of particles. So if you think about a swimming pool, the surface is the top of the water, and then the core is what's below that. For a lot of these things, you really only care about what's happening at the surface of the water. Maybe not in our case here, but if you were simulating, say, an ocean, say you had a boat sitting in the water on the ocean. Well, the interaction of the boat with the surface of the water is the most important part. What's happening below that is really not that important. So a lot of times what I do in situations like that, I'll turn up my surface particle sampling and not really worry too much about the core, okay? Because generally when you generate a mesh, it generates a mesh at the top of the surface and not necessarily below that. So, but for this simulation, it doesn't. We're just going to leave that as is for now. Okay, so we've turned on stream, so it's going to keep constantly emitting fluid, and then we've told it constant, and we've given it a speed there. Okay, now what you will notice is before. So I'm going to turn off. Let's turn off stream here, and okay, so there we go. Oh, wait, no. None. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to hit, what are we on here? I'm going to hit 7. Okay, just so we can see this. If you hit 7 on the keyboard, it'll put everything in bounding boxes. So very useful. So there's our emitter locator. Okay, when I set it to stream and then set this to constant, notice that this turns into an arrow. Okay, and what that means is that's the direction of emission. That's the direction it's going to emit the particles. So if I leave it like this, it's going to emit particles straight down. And what you might get, so I'm going to hit 0 here. And then because this, I need to, oh, here we go. So I went over. So keep hitting D. So what's going to happen is you're probably going to get water splashing out the sides this way because the water is getting just pushed at a speed of 5 downwards, so it's going to obviously react and then might spill out the sides here. So obviously we don't want that. So what I could do is take the actual emitter and rotate it. Notice that the box does not rotate with it. So it doesn't really matter about the box. You can, if you want, take the box, the emitter geometry, and rotate that, and you can see it takes the emitter locator with it. Or you can just rotate the emitter itself and tell it to rotate that way. So however you want to do that, that's fine. But because I had sized my box the way that I like, I'm going to do it this way. And I'm going to put a slight downward angle on it. Okay, so that it just goes that way. And at any time you can still change the size of this emitter box here, and it's not going to affect the actual emission. Okay, so keep that in mind there. So now I'm telling it basically to emit in that direction, which is the direction I want the water to go. So that's good. And then I have a speed of 5 and a speed variation of 2.5. So let's go with that and see what we get. I'm going to save. And, for this, let's see. Let's turn off command line for a second so that I can see it kind of real time here. Hopefully nothing crashes. And let's give it a second here. If I try this and the the rendering simulating right in the interface is not giving me, it's taking way too long or whatever, then I'll just go back to command line. Okay, so there's the particles. And you can see, I mean, this is taking a bit here, even for this few particles. So you can see I have way more particles now. Okay, that's because I basically doubled my resolution by cutting that number in half. Okay, and you can see that they're moving. Okay, so the interface, you can still rotate, but it's a little chuggy. Um, so we'll just give it another frame or so. Okay, so I am getting movement. So the speed value that you have in here is going to determine how quickly this generates more particles to push out. Okay, if you got it really slow, it's going to do it very slowly. But if you got it really fast, it's going to generate a lot of particles really quickly. Okay, so let it do one more step, and then I'm going to stop it here. Okay, so I'm going to hit the stop simulation. It's stopping, and just give it a second here. And things flash, and sometimes it'll crash, but not this time. Now notice the particles are really white. That's because again, they're shaded according to their velocity. So where is that? That's down here. So the property is velocity. So the faster they are, the closer they are to the white end of the spectrum. So they're really white. Okay, so that's what we have right there. So we can go back. You can see that's what we're having now. I think you can see how they're already climbing over here. So I'm probably gonna have some spill over here. So that might be that my emitter is a little too big. It's just pouring out too many, but we'll see. Now, what's hard to see is actually the gap between the geometry and the particles. It's actually not too bad. And remember that value is at a cell size of 0.1. So the closer you want this water to hug the geometry, the smaller this number has to be. We need to shrink down those voxels. So from this point of view right here, it's actually not too bad. I guess I will leave it. Once you start meshing, so this is going to take a lot of trial and error. There's no just set it and then be done really quick. You're going to have to do a lot of trial and error. You got to run some meshes to check that things are working. So for example, if I select my river water, come to mesh and do a particle VDB mesh here. Okay, and sometimes it won't connect. And I think it has to connect to the emitter. Let's go ahead and right click here and build. So there it is. Yeah, it connects to the emitter, not the domain. And I'm going to hit D a couple times here. So, what was that? F. There we go. If you hit F, it sets it so when you rotate, if your scene is really heavy, then when you rotate, if you hit F, it's going to go to bounding box because that's a lot easier to draw than having to redraw the full resolution geometry all the time. So this actually speeds you up. I don't need it in this case. But there you go. So there's our mesh. Obviously, this is very low resolution here. And the mesh is touching the water. I'm sorry, touching the floor here. So that's probably fine. We're getting a little bit of interpenetration, which again is actually good because then it gives a flatter bottom to the water instead of this sort of rounded edge that makes it look really unrealistic. So you want some interpenetration here. So looks like a 0.1 is actually fine as far as cell size here for the geometry here. So we'll see as that goes on. So this is just a test mesh. I can now delete it because I'm not meshing right now and I don't need it in my scene slowing things down. So I'm just going to delete it for the time being. Okay. Next thing you want to look at is resolution. Obviously that resolution is not very high. So you would want to keep, where's that value? Cell size. So you would want to go down here now. I don't know, depending on how high res I'm looking to go here, I might lower this down to 0.05 if I'm really serious about getting detail, or 0.075. or or point one. Point one is about where I like to stay, just because it's a good balance between detail and simulation time. Okay, once you go below point one, I mean you're gonna be simulating. It might be a few days to get a simulation done. And the thing that we need to keep in mind when simulating something like this, if you're simulating like a river like this, is that obviously the river is not just starting to fill up with water. So you have to simulate all this down until it gets over here and spills over. And you got to let it run until you reach that equilibrium that I was talking about, where you have right about the same number coming in as are going out, so that this thing doesn't look like it's filling up. Because what's going to happen is, if you assume that's happening too soon, you're gonna and then you play it back, you're gonna see your water sort of filling up slowly, which means you haven't reached equilibrium, which means you've got more coming in than are going out. So you gotta let it run, and this might take, honestly, it might take a couple days to get to that point, and then save that as an initial state. Okay, so what is initial state? So initial state is where you want the water to start. You don't want the water to start with no particles. You want it to start with that equilibrium state. So if you click on our domain here, the river water, you'll see that there's an initial state here. If you say use initial state, that turns on that thing, but you have to then define the initial state by clicking make initial state. So I've clicked on that. Now it's not going to work. You'll see that if I reset, it's gone. So it did not save that value. So that was frame. So let's bring back these. I was at frame 6. Okay, so if you want to actually start from the initial state, you got to click here on reset and tell it to reset to initial state. If you click on that, now when I reset, you'll see that my simulated frames are going to disappear, but my my particles are still there, because that's my new starting point. So once you've got to that equilibrium state, then you can tell it to set your initial state, okay, and then simulate from there. So for this, though, I'm not there yet, so I'm going to turn this off and just reset, and it's going to start from 0. For this demonstration, I'm going to turn this up so that it's not taking too long. I will show you an example here on, let me see. So I've simulated this before, and I will show you an update here. So this is just on my Vimeo page here. So this is the simulation. That's the base. Let me slow this down here. So this is the base simulation. This is the Hybrido particles. And it's kind of hard for me to see how many there were, but there's quite a few, a few million in there. So this is the Hybrido particles, okay, and then this is your foam. So the foam, these are the secondaries. So this is the foam. So these are all particles that I can lay on top, and you can see I get this foaming action. If you look at it as it's going, it looks like foam in the water. And then this is the splash. This is a separate one that's also now added in here. Okay, you can see it, especially down in here. See, if I go back to where it's just foam, the foam doesn't really splash. The foam sticks to the surface of the water, where the splash actually splashes outward. So if we go forward, then that's your splash. So that's the Hybrido core simulation with the foam and the splash together. Okay, and this is what it looks like on that sim. So you can get some really nice splashing right here where the water is sort of dropping a couple steps here. And then this is the actual meshed core simulation. We mesh the core, but we don't mesh the secondaries. Okay, so that's what we got going on there. Okay, so that's what that simulation is going to look like. So you got to do this in passes, and it does take a minute to set everything up. So if you want to see just the mesh by itself here, there's the mesh, and it's a decent detail. But when you then layer on all this other stuff and render it, you get a pretty nice simulation. Okay, so I'll give you an example here of a rendered version of this here in After Effects real quick. So this is rendered with a little bit of vegetation here. It's one of my test renders. But you can see what the simulation ends up looking like. Now you can see that my foam here is really grainy. You can actually see individual particles. That's because I hadn't turned it up as high as I would where the final thing. Plus, there's really no motion blur in here to blur that out a little bit. So these are all things that you have to think about. But look at the detail in the water coming up there. You can get this to look pretty. You see the splashes, all that is splashes. So you can combine the splashes and the foam. The foam is this stuff sitting on the water surface. Um, and then the core simulation, which is the clear water, is what we're trying to go for here. Obviously, again, these would need to be. I would really have to turn up those secondary particles so that they're not so you can tell individual particles. And again, forgive the little Arnold watermark here. That's because again I batch rendered it because batch render is always faster than rendering a sequence, right? In Arnold. With this simulation, I had not done a wet map here, but it's easy enough to fake it if you know where the water is basically touching everything. All you got to do is then paint your own wet map, really. There's not always a need to have it be dynamic, but that always adds to the realism. But if the rocks have, if this river has been flowing for thousands of years, so these rocks are probably just always wet anyway. So you could just fake it, but if you have the time, it really doesn't take much to do a wet map there. You could darken the ground texture underneath here where the water is over the ground here just to get that slight wet feel. So this is what we're aiming for right here. Okay, this is very nice. Again, I got all these rocks under there, so I'm getting very nice movement. You don't see it too much in the core simulation as you do in the foam. So the foam, because you see how everything's moving and whatnot, you can kind of really see how the surface of that water is changing quite a bit. And that's because there's those rocks in there. If there's no rocks under there, you'd have this really fake-looking sheet of foam that just didn't feel right. So that's what we're getting. Once you light everything and all this, you get some pretty nice-looking results. So that's what we're going for here. Okay, let me get out of After Effects here. And I'm just going to turn back my command line on here. And again, I lowered this just so we could simulate a few more particles so we can see what we're getting here. So let's go ahead and save and then run a sim. And it's going to go through its thing. And I'm just going to let this run for a little bit here. And then I'll be back to see what we got. All right. All right, we are 71 frames in, and basically we are at about 29,000 particles. This is actually very little. Okay, it's taken about 11 minutes 45 seconds. So yeah, these do take a while. So I'm gonna stop this because it's locked up my computer. If you look at my CPU usage here, I'm pegged at 100%. Most of the time, every time it starts a new frame, then it kicks up again to 100%. So my CPU is very high. You see my memory usage is not honestly that high. And it's really only taxing one of my video cards here. So it's more about the processor speed because the Hybrido simulations do not leverage. I'm going to stop this just to let my system. There we go. We're back. The Hybrido simulations do not leverage the video card, at least not the NVIDIA card. So if we go into the options here and look at Hybrido, where are we here? So if you have an OpenCL video card, it will use that, but it will not use a CUDA card like with Diversa. You can pick between the ones that you want. With Hybrido, you get CUDA, you get OpenCL support, but no CUDA support. So if you're running like an NVIDIA, not NVIDIA, like an AMD card, you could probably use that. Sadly, I'm running 2 NVIDIA cards, which is not getting me anything here. So it is what it is. I do have 32 cores in here, 64 threads. So there's a point where, if you got enough processors, you might be outrunning your video card anyway, so you might not get anything extra from the video card. So, I mean, that's just going to depend on your system. While I'm in here, we can go through here and, you can adjust the different settings here as needed. Don't mess with the time scale. So you can adjust the step in the minimum max sub steps of the actual particles here. Usually, I think this was 300 by default. I set it to 150, and then sometimes I will increase the minimum sub steps. But right now, I'm going to leave it as is. Um, so let's see what we got. Let's see what it simulated. So I got 70 something frames here. Let's go ahead and see how this looks. I'm going to save, and let's run that. So we got the water running down, and we're getting it hitting that corner. You can see what I did. If I go back to Maya here, you can see the way that I modeled this. I modeled it as if that water's been sort of undercutting this bank for a long time. Okay, and then have a little bit of an overhang here to try to avoid splash out. I'm trying to keep the water from just running up the wall and back out. So if you did that underhang, if water is coming down here, down this corner really fast, it's going to undercut this bank here. It's going to dig into this wall here. So I'll put a little bit of that in there. And you can see it works to an extent, but eventually the water does sort of fly out. And really the main issue here is that my emitter is putting out water a little too fast. So if we can go down to 2, and then just let gravity do most of this work, I think we'll be fine, because now it's just too fast and it's causing that water to shoot off there. So again, a lot of trial and error. I mean, there's no quick fix here. Every scene is different. You're going to have to do tests and see what works, adjust it as needed. So I got some water coming down here, and then it turns a corner. And the longer if I'd let this run, you'd see that eventually just water would just start to really come out of this thing. So, and what's happening is the water is all sort of forced to this wall, so it's sort of coming down on this side, and we don't really have much going on here. So we just got to slow this thing down. It doesn't have to be a raging river. It could be just some nice little slow-flowing waterfall here. So, all the trial and error I do at the lower resolution. So my river water is at a 0.3. And then once things start to feel like they're right, then I'll up the resolution. Maybe not to my final cell size, but I'll up it and then let it run overnight or whatever, and then see what happens. A sim of this scale, and this is a decently large scale simulation here. Could take a few days to simulate, take a week even. So it just depends on what it is you're trying to do. Maybe work at a smaller scale if you want to have it be quicker, or maybe just make a scene that is not as doesn't feel quite as big as this. That's entirely up to you to decide how you want to do that. Okay, so that is what we have right now. Yeah, I didn't even realize this before, but you can see that because it's so fast, and part of it is also because the box is really big, so there's a lot of water being put out at any time. We're getting water running up here. So you can see that we're getting, that it's too fast. But the back wall here is working fine. We got no water to worry about going that way. So okay, so you just got to play with it until you get something that you like. So I'm going to reset this. Okay, so that's basically how we would set this up here. Okay, the gravity's working, the kill volume's working, and all this stuff here is working just fine. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how the water is going to come out of here. So, you know what? I'm going to get my emitter box here and just shrink it down a little bit. Okay, so, and then maybe move it down. Okay, so what I want to do here is if I select, now I can do this either with the box itself. Let's go ahead, emitter geo. We're going to come up here to the rotation values, open this up, and we're going to look at see, you can adjust the Y rotation here. So let's undo. Okay, so I'm going to keyframe this Y rotation, and the reason is I'm going to have it sort of oscillate like this. And the reason I do that is so that the water is not coming out of this perfectly straight line. I'm actually having oscillate, which means some of the water is going to bounce against this wall, some of it's going to bounce on this side, and then have to come back and then recollide with itself. Again, trying to just churn up the water to make it to add to that simulation. You can even do a little bit up and down. Again, you don't want to overdo it. You don't want this thing going crazy like that. You just want a little bit. You just want a little bit of oscillation here and there. Even this, if you want, you could do just to really add something to it. But let's start with the rotate Y. So let's go back to frame 0 here. And I'm just going to set a keyframe. Okay. And then, I don't know, let's go a few frames. Rotate it just a little bit. Keyframe. Go a couple frames up. Rotate the other way just a little bit. Keyframe. So on and so forth. The other thing you can do is just go to the end here. And usually for a simulation like this, you want a lot of frames. So I might up this to 2,000. Oops, what did I do? There we go. I might increase this to 2,000. That way we got a lot of frames to deal with. And let me set this. Oops. Select this. There we go. Okay, so and then what I could do is just here. I can set a key way over here. And then I could just use the graph editor to keyframe the keys in between. So go to right click, edit curve, select Y, and then we could just start control clicking in here all over the place. And this is 1,000 frames, so you might want to make your keyframes closer to each other because it is 1,000. It's 2,000 frame span actually. So I'm just control clicking in here, okay, and let's enlarge this. Okay, so then what we can do is just start to, you know, really you could just go crazy with this, just to get what, try to make it feel kind of random, making sure, of course, that you don't go too far with it. So, I'm going to have to check these values to see if they work. Maybe down here. Okay, so something like that. And let's just watch our cube here as I go through. Okay, and maybe if I'm going to just play it so it's going through real time. And you can see that that's not a whole lot of motion there. So actually what I could do, so the other thing, if you don't want to put in 2,000 keyframes, let's stop this. If you don't want to put in 2,000 keyframes worth of keys there, what you can do is let's go ahead and just delete. Oops. Let's delete those keys. So I'm just going to hit delete. So where are we at here? Let's delete that one. And oops, I forget what the navigation is here. That's control. Here, let's just get our magnifying glass and put it right in here. So I'm going to set another keyframe here and get our, where to go? That's the where's our move tool? Okay. Let's get rid of that guy there. Actually. Where's move? Come on. Okay, so yeah. When you're on a tool, to get back to move tool, just click the tool again, and now I can move stuff like before. And also, if you want to zoom in on your graph, so you can just hit this button here. It's going to just frame up your keys. So what we're going to do is just we're just going to repeat our simulation. So let's go ahead and maybe put another keyframe right in here. Put maybe another one right here. Take this guy up here. So if you don't want to do 2,000 frames worth of keyframes, let's put another one here. You could do a few, and then we're going to just loop the animation. So just like you would in Maya, 3D Studio Max, or whatever it is. We're just going to loop this. So maybe, how many frames is that? About almost 60. So let's say we go back here. Okay, so let's see what that looks like, and then we can. Okay, so it's pretty quick. And again, trial and error thing. Uh, maybe make it so they're not so tall, so that we're not getting crazy water just going all over the place. Okay, so let's try that. Then what we can do is to loop that, we can go here to keys, and we can go to last node behavior, and we can loop. Okay, now anytime you're going to do a loop, you got to make sure that the first key and the last key have the same value. So I'm going to select this, and I want to make sure that my X value is actually 0, because that's a 0 key. And say we got a Y value of, say, negative 35. Okay, so that we want to put a negative 35 in the end one as well, so negative 35. So now we get a proper looping here like that. So let's see what that looks like. So if we play it back, we're going to get movement like that. There we go. So it's just going to loop. You shouldn't be able to tell the difference versus making a whole bunch of keyframes. So there's two different ways that you could go about doing this. I like to just loop it because it's easier. Okay. And again, if this rotation ends up being too much, you can just come in here and shorten the peaks and the valleys. Just get them closer to each other, and then you'll have less rotation happening there. Okay. So at the lower speed, I think we should hopefully be okay. So let's go ahead and stop this. Go back to the beginning here. So that we've added some variation there. The other thing you want to do, and again, any way that I can come up with to vary things. Okay, so we put a little bit of speed variation, a little angle rotation variation. We can also keyframe the speed. I mean, even though we have speed variation, we can also just add on top of that by keyframing our speed. So I'm going to start at a speed of 2 here. Then here, let me set this back to 200 so I don't have such a big range. Let's say go to frame 5 or 6, something like that. And let's increase to 3. Let's key that. Go up a few more. Go to like 1.5. So I'm gonna hang around that original 2, but I'm gonna increase and decrease as I go here. Oh, I forgot to set the key here. So let's go 1.5 and set the key. And again, if you want, you can just go into edit the curve here. And let's zoom out, control click a few times. That and go there. Maybe not so high, maybe there. Control click, go down here, really slow it down and then speed it back up. Go here. And then speed it back up a little bit there. And then control click down here. And then again, so let's zoom in on here. Value of 2, so we want our last keyframe to be at a value of 2, so we'll set that to 2. Keys, last node behavior, loop, and that's what we have here. Maybe bring this guy closer, and we can, you don't want to be too even, so this one I'm going to really make pretty tight here. Then the other ones that can be a little wider apart. And let's just make sure that I'm still at 2 here and here, which is right. Good. Okay, so that's just going to increase and decrease the speed of the simulation. All right, so there we go. So let's see what that looks like. Hopefully it won't be crazy, and if it is, we can always fix it. Then the other thing, like I said before, is the friction on the surface. Now I'm going to wait on this because as soon as I put friction, the water is going to cover ground much slower because the ground is going to be gripping onto the water a little bit more because of friction. But so right now in the early stages of testing here, I'm going to do it without increasing the friction, and then as I start to get closer to where I want my water to be, then I'll introduce that friction right under here, grid friction. Okay. And then there's an interaction factor where if you want the geometry to have more of an effect on the fluid, you can amplify that by increasing your interaction factor. Okay. And then friction bandwidth. It's just a sort of the zone of influence of the grid friction. Okay, so you get different things between the particles on the surface, on the object surface, and the rest of the fluid. Okay, so you can play with that or not. Again, look up all these values here to see what you want to mess around with. Okay, so every time I go to simulate a new test, I'll go into my folder. So I just set up this project the same way I did in the previous videos. So here's my waterfall, and then the particles are stored in RPC. I'm just gonna go, and you see it's river water. I'm just gonna go select all these and delete them. Okay. So now when I hit this button, oh, you know what? It's going to also. So there's many things that will bring up your cache files here. So the particles themselves are not included in that, but there's also that one mesh that I made, so we can get rid of that. There's also under objects, animation SD, and all these cache BDCs. So that's one thing. Usually I always do that, but I totally forgot to do it this time. So we hit F12 to go into Export Central and turn off animation.sd and cache BDC. Okay, those I don't need. The river water is right here. Generally, I leave things at the default. Use RPCs for these. You could also use bin particles, which is the 3D Studio Max sort of default particles. But no, I'm just going to leave them at RPC, and that should be good. Right now, I'm not worried about wet maps, so I'm not activating that just yet. I need to get the simulation looking good before I worry about that. Okay, so it's done here. Now let's reset this and see if I hit this. You can see now I get none of that because I've deleted anything that was cached that would cause that to happen is now gone. So now when I run the simulation, I'm doing it fresh. Okay, so I'm going to run this again, and I'll be back with the new results. Okay, so I have now let this thing run well into over 600 frames just to see what it's going to look like. So let's go ahead and just scrub through here. As you can see, this is what we're getting here. Okay, so the water is able to run through. Now we got a lot of craziness over here with some particles. I think the speed is a little too high still, so I am going to drop that down. Bear in mind that while the lower poly count on this simulation looks a certain way, and then if you turn it up, there's going to be differences just because the way the voxels work. I think a lot of this stuff going on here probably won't happen once I turn up the simulation a little bit. Things will be tighter. It'll hold together better. You'll see that with these particles, there's like big gaps between the particles. That's because it's all dealing with it's if you got to visualize it in voxels, like cubes, basically. So the larger the cell size, the further apart some of these particles can be. And then you get this effect. So as soon as if I was doing a final thing, I might go 0.1 or 0.05 or something like that, and these particles are going to pack together really tight and be more sort of cohesive and follow the physics a little bit better. So this is a very, very loose approximation at this resolution of what's happening. So I don't think we'll have too many of these issues. But what I will do, though, is just turn down the emitter speed, and because it's got a curve on it, I can edit that curve, and I could just lower each of these, and then the ones that are down here, just raise them up a little bit. So we're going to keep that speed. So this right here is a speed of 2. So we're going to maybe here's to the 2. We'll start at like 1.5 or something, or just 1. Let's just do 1. So then the last one I'm going to do at 1 as well, so that the loop works. And then we can just sort of bring this way down here. Bring it up, have 2 be sort of the maximum speed, and then everything else is just below there. Okay, we're just going to vary it up just a little bit. Or we can actually do some of this here. Okay, something like that. And then here to get rid of the spike, I can just flatten this tangent, and then also flatten this one. Okay, so now that'll get nice and smooth in there. So, we've lowered the speed overall. Definitely use the graph. It really does help because then the water coming in is not just coming in at this very fake looking constant speed. You sort of increase and decrease as you go. Um, so that's one thing I'm going to do there. If we look at, it's really hard to tell the effect of having this sort of oscillate a little bit at this resolution. I think it is having an effect, but at this resolution, it's probably having a very minimal effect. Okay. Um, just continuing to look at it here, you see we're sort of pooling and then spilling over these rocks here. Again, this is just because right now we're at a very low resolution, so I got really large voxels in there. So the water is really, it's able to go places that it probably wouldn't go once we lower the voxel size, the cell size. Okay, so just bear that in mind as you work on this. This is not an exact approximation. It's close, but it's not perfect. So you really have to turn down the settings. Um, and then you'll see that you probably won't get any of these single. Anytime you see single particles like this, these aren't really gonna affect much. Let me go ahead and do a mesh real quick, just to see. Now with the hybrido particles, there's actually a hybrido mesh. Okay, so I'm going to use the hybrido mesh VDB. So the other two use a different type of mesh. This one is made specifically for hybrido. So there it is right there. And let's go, let me see here. Let's turn on the splash thinning filter. So it tries to make your splashes look good. You could also do the core smoothing filter, but generally I don't do that because that's the core of the fluid. I've never really felt the need, but you could try it out and see what that does. Definitely turn on the splash thinning filter. And then, you got your volume filters like with the other simulation in the previous video. You can turn those on. I'm going to leave those off for right now and just see what we have. Now, obviously, it's not going to be very nice because my cell size is so low. But let's go ahead and just build this and see what it gives us. Okay, so that was pretty quick, as you can see. This because there's really very few particles. I'm going to go ahead and hide the river water here just so we can see that. So this is what we're getting. Okay, so we got a little bit of meshing here, but these single particles, sometimes you get this, and this is not very good here. But like I said, with the final mesh, it probably won't soften that. It probably won't be too much of an issue. So this is the mesh so far. Very low res, not very nice, but I am seeing some nice stuff here. I'm seeing some nice splashing going on in here. I like how this is sort of hitting this rock and then pouring over. All this stuff is going to make for really nice detail. Wow, with the final sim here, getting nice sort of turbulence in the water right in here. That's all good stuff. And then we're getting it sort of tearing apart as it falls over the edge here. That's really nice as well. And that's only going to look nicer when it's done. And then here's sort of our bank area where you can walk in here. And then the water is staying about where I wanted it to be. So overall, this is looking pretty good. The rocks are blocking the water from going too far. Here again, you probably won't get this once we slow down the water. We reduce the speed on it, so that's going to help with that. The water is just going to more naturally go according to just the slope of the surface, which is kind of what we want. Obviously, if I slow the water down, that means this thing's going to take much longer to fill up. So I'm going to hide my mesh here. Let's look at how many frames it took. So let's bring back this and let's hide the mesh. So let's look at how many frames it took to get the water all the way down to the bottom of the waterfall there. So, we went down and let's see. So it took well over 250 frames to start dropping particles off of there. And we can preview this. So if you want to preview anything, so first of all, I'm going to go to so 622 is my last frame. I just hit this button right here. So I'm going to set this to 622 just so that it doesn't try to preview frames that don't have anything on them. And I want to go here and do an OpenGL preview. So this is like in Maya play blasting, where it's just going to make a little video file of the preview so that you can play it back in real time. Because if I hit it playing here, it may or may not play in real time, but if I do it this way with the preview, then it definitely will play at real time. So you can really get a feel for the water. Does it feel like water? Is it too thick? Is it too thin? Things like that. So we're going to let this go here about halfway. I'm gonna let it preview. So anytime you do dynamics, you want to do previews because it's really hard to tell if, especially with water. Water has a certain feel to it, and you know it as soon as you see it. So you need to run this back because especially when you have really high particle counts, you're not going to be able to scrub. You're not even going to be able to scrub the timeline to see the movement. So you definitely want to preview it. And when you got high particle counts, you may have to walk away from the computer for 20, 30 minutes for the preview to happen, just because things get heavy. So this is what we have here. And again, I'm working at 24, so I have 24 in there. So this is kind of the speed that we have here. Okay, this is playing back real time, 24 frames a second. So what I'm seeing here is it's just too fast. The water's coming in too hard. It's making it feel too much like a raging river, which is not exactly what I'm looking for here. So definitely slowing it down is going to help. But overall, so yeah, we're getting a lot of the water's just jumping around a lot just because it's coming in so hot, it's coming in so fast. So once we lower that down, it should not be too big of an issue. Even though we are getting some really nice stuff here, you can see where the water falls, it turns white. Where it's falling, it's gaining speed, like even here. So that's really nice detail there. That's going to create a lot of foam and a lot of splash for us. So that's actually pretty good. But you get that anyway, just because that's happening mainly because of gravity, because it has to fall off the ledge there. So we'll get that anyway. Okay, so this is looking pretty good for this low res of a simulation. So once you have it looking the way that you want, from that point now it's to, let me get rid of the mesh. Once you test with the mesh, get rid of it. Otherwise, when you simulate, it's going to be building the mesh as you go. Or if you don't want to get rid of it, you can simply turn it off. So right here, turn this little rocket here red, and it won't build it. But you'll see that what'll happen is it's every time it goes to a frame where there is no built mesh for that frame, you're going to get this error here. So for me, that gets annoying. So I just delete it, and I can put it in at the end. I just use it for testing, and I get rid of it. Okay, so at this point, then you could, if you're happy with the animation and whatnot, you've done all your tweaks, then you can come in here and then drop this down to something that your computer can handle. That's not going to take 2 weeks to simulate, and then run that. And see what you get. Keep checking back on it. One thing to note is when you do a command line simulation, you can actually shut down Realflow. Okay, leave the command line window open, but shut down Realflow. That's going to free up some resources for you to be able to for the simulation to go faster. Okay, so that does not need to be on. Just turn, start the command line and then just completely turn off, shut down Realflow, and anything else that might be running on your computer, you want to shut down. You don't want to try to use your computer while it's simulating, so it's a good thing to do at night. And if you're using a laptop, laptops aren't really great for this type of stuff. Like, if it's what you got, that's what you got. But laptops generally are not designed to take that heavy a load for that long a period of time. So it will wear down your laptop faster than a desktop. But it's still manageable. You can still do it. Okay, so definitely it's something that you want to do overnight as you sleep, so that you're not having to try to work at the same time. It's just not going to work out well for you if you're trying to do actual work while you have a simulation going. Now, it is possible, if you go in the options here, it is possible to, right here where it says use max threads, if you don't want to use all your threads, you could because I have a total of 64 threads here, you could lower this. So if you wanted to save, say, one of the cores, so I have 32 cores, 64 threads with the multi-threading. If you wanted to save one of your cores to be able to do other stuff, you could try to do that. It's hit and miss whether it actually helps. So instead of 64, you could take it down to 62, so that it's actually leaving out one of the cores. I just let it run. I just, right before I go to bed, I'll start the sim. And I'll wait for the first frame or two to come in just so I can check it to make sure it's doing all right. And then when that's doing fine, then I will just shut down Realflow and then just let it run overnight and call it good. Um, and then your sub steps here. If you this is going to affect your accuracy of the simulation. So the default is 300 in here. So when I'm doing the final one, I'll usually do like 25 to 300. Okay. Now having a minimum sub step of 25 instead of 1 is going to slow your simulation down. Okay, because that means every frame is at least going to do 25 sub steps versus 1. Um, that's just something I choose to do. You can leave this at 1 and leave this 150 if you want, and then see what you get. Um, you're probably going to do this a couple times. You're probably going to simulate this a few times. You're going to simulate it overnight, come back, and it's okay, but it's not where you want it. You're going to tweak some settings, and you're going to do it again. And you probably do it a couple more times till you get where you want. Okay, so that's just the name of the game. That's how this works. You gotta, I've done simulations over and over again, just to tweak them and get them to where I want. Okay, so that's the start there. I'm gonna cut this video here, and then in the next video, I'll show you a sim that I already did for this, and we'll also talk about the secondaries. So under Hybrido, we have our splash, our foam, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about these and how they work in the next video. Okay, so yeah, I guess I will see you in the next one. Bye.